I'd you take your Bibles, please, and turn to the book of Malachi. We come to the last prophet in this series of lessons dealing with taking the books in chronological order. And if we've made a mistake so far, I think we got this one right, don't you? It's at the end of the Old Testament. Maybe it's the end of the prophets as well. But if we can think about Ezra coming during the time when the people from Jerusalem in Babylon captivity came out. And we know Zerubbabel was first, and then Ezra comes along. And then who comes along later as far as this returning for the purposes of we're rebuilding the temple and getting the priesthood right with Ezra and teaching? Who comes along that has to do something that is important to the city? What's his name? Nehemiah. So we got in our books Ezra, Nehemiah. We have those books that are together. And Malachi, as we'll see in a few moments, either comes before Nehemiah and after Ezra, or he may have come after Nehemiah or during the middle of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah is an interesting one because you see about intermarriage and you see about marriages being unlawful. Malachi deals with unlawful marriages as well. And we'll see how maybe that all fits together. The word Malachi simply means my messenger. And God's people, we know, had returned from Babylonian captivity, and they've probably been here a little over 100 years. Think about that. That it wasn't just coming back and said, we got to rebuild the temple, Zechariah, Haggai. Well, they did all that. Now we fast forward a few years. Ezra's dead. During the time of Nehemiah, rebuilding the walls. But they've probably been back for 100 years. The temple's been built. There's the leaders that had come, like Ezra, has probably died by this time, and he's not mentioned anymore. Malachi, so forth, is kind of the one bringing forth the word of God. So we kind of look at that time, and what has happened is that the people, they're falling short of the glory of God. As we'll see in these three chapters, chapter 1, there'll be the idea of the pollution of their worship and sacrifices, that they were not right, mainly because of indifference of what they offered and because of their living ungodly lives. And they offered them. There's some lessons there for us as we will take note in just a few moments. But their worship and their sacrifices were displeasing unto God. He was not going to accept them. And we'll see, especially in the area of where they had married foreign women, they had just flippantly divorced their wives, and the tears are on the altar, and God's not accepting their sacrifice because of their divorce. And that's what we learn in chapter 2, that divorce is something that displeases God. Chapter 3, verse 8, we'll see that their tithes, as they were lawfully supposed to give, they were not giving that with living the holy life as they should, but they were not giving it all. You're robbing God, and therefore God's displeased with that. Tithes under the old law had to be offered, which was what? We talk about 10% of what they took in as far as their crops and their animals and so forth. They offered a tenth of that. Now, when we think about tithing and realizing that's under the old law, let's say, no, I think that'd be a good idea. Just like keeping the Sabbath would be a good idea for Seventh-day Adventists, that we'll do that under the law of Christ. And we got the Sabbath day that we're not to make judgments upon people regarding the Sabbath day because we're under a new covenant. But let's say we didn't have any new covenant, there's nothing in there against it, but where do we find it being mentioned as part of the worship and part of the work of the church in the New Testament? You don't have it. Just like you don't have instrumental music. You have singing and you have giving as you've been what? Prospered. It wasn't 10%. It knows as you've been prospered. And that would be a value that you place upon how God you prosper me. I'm giving you accordingly back as I have been prospered. As it literally means I've done well on this journey, and you've been part of that, God, and I'm going to give that back to you. Well, they're robbing God. They've got and that's the law upon them, and that's why we don't tithe, because we're under the New Testament law, and that's why we don't keep the seventh day holy, because that's under the Old Testament law. We're under the New Testament. What day of the week was important to the Christian? The first day of the week. And when it was Lithuania, the first day of the week was Saturday, because they've got Catholicism entrenched there. So that's the Christian Sabbath, is Sunday, and they call that the Christian Sabbath. So they'll have it on this Sunday becomes the seventh day. Monday's the first day, and that always messed me up because I'm used to looking at calendars, and so I'd have to make sure I'm supposed to be here at that class and on those days. But that's the way the calendar was set. But we realize that we're under a new covenant law. But we can see some principles about when the sacrifices were ordered. Why don't God just accept them? I tithe, or no, I mean not tithe, but I gave sacrifices, and there's got to be the quality of it, and there's got to be living a holy life connected with it. And we learned that. Those are principles that we'll see. And as I already mentioned, chapter 2 deals with their marriages and the divorces that they were doing. God hates putting away. God hates divorce. So, there's 3 chapters that we see, and we come in the 4th chapter. It's kind of a short chapter, but he's dealing with their sins, and therefore things need to be corrected. The author of the book is Malachi. It's my messenger. And I just want you to remember from our study of Haggai, a very descriptive phrase is used, and this is my messenger. But notice how Haggai presents it, which is just talk about inspiration. God breathes. The words are from God. And Haggai, the 1st chapter, verse 13, then spake Haggai, Jehovah's messenger. So Malachi means my messenger. As a prophet, he is God's, Jehovah's messenger. But Haggai says, it's just one setting forth that Haggai spake, Jehovah's messenger in Jehovah's message unto the people, saying, I am with you, saith Jehovah. Remember, this is to encourage the people to fulfill that work of rebuilding the temple. I'm with you. I'm going to help you. And he's encouraging them. My messenger, my message. This isn't some man's message. My messenger has my message. God's word is being brought forth by his messenger. So when we see the translation from Alexandria, Egypt, of the Old Testament into Greek, do you see something that might be translated messenger, but it's translated another way? The word of the Lord by the hand of his what? Well, do you understand it's not a contradiction? When we look at the definition, what are angels? They're the messengers, but we think about spiritual beings as being above mankind and my messengers. And that's idea. So we get a kind of miraculous thing that here's an angel that did that, but it's belongs to him. His angel, my messenger is giving that. And we know that came from Malachi, who was a man that was involved in presenting God's word. The name occurs nowhere else in the Old Testament. No other time that we're going to find Malachi mentioned here. And he becomes the last prophet that presents God's message until the time of the coming of John the Baptist and, of course, the coming of Jesus. And so there'll be a 400-year gap between the end of Malachi and the beginning of the history of the New Covenant, and God is silent about hey, you're my messenger. There's no record of him said, here's my prophet, here's my message. And what happened in those 400 years, we got sects of the Jews, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. We've got synagogues being set up in the cities when they had enough males and to have one in that city. Philippi didn't have enough males because we found them meeting at the river and place of prayer there. But they had synagogues and all the things that we read in the New Testament as being here, Sadducees, Pharisees, and all of those things. Why all of a sudden? Because there's 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and the New Testament history. And God has a interesting farewell that will link together with the New Testament real well from God's own word. We'll do that. So there's the author of the book. We think about the date. Here's a broad range because we look at a couple of ideas about when the book was written. But we can date it, so let's just say round numbers 450 to 430 BC. We're looking at around the time of Nehemiah. After the days of Ezra, that was around 457 BC. And before the days of Nehemiah, 444 to 432, that's when some say it was written. After Ezra, but before the days of Nehemiah. Question mark. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. That doesn't mean it didn't occur. I offered that for one reason why people have it. Sometimes they even they'll have it in the days of the Maccabees. That it was way later than what we're thinking about. It's in the coming in time of Jesus and so forth. Well, still BC. But this is a possibility. We think about that date as being Nehemiah, and let's just link the book of Nehemiah in a part. What happens in Nehemiah? If you'll turn there with me, in Nehemiah 13 and verse 6. So you got Ezra and Nehemiah, they're together, and we kind of know why. But Nehemiah 13:6, we see that Nehemiah takes a break from being governor. But in all this time, I was not at Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went unto the king, and after certain days asked I leave of the king. And I came to Jerusalem and understood the evil the Elishabib had done for Tobiah in preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God, and it grieved me sore. So here he's away for a certain time. That time could have been between 1 or 3 years that he was gone. So Nehemiah comes along, and we get to the end of his book. He speaks about going up to Jerusalem, leaving Jerusalem, and going back to serve Artaxerxes for a while, at least to meet with him. And he may stay there 1 to 3 years. Then he returns back. So some have thought, and I think this is a plausible one, that it was sure fit with Nehemiah coming along and executing the law of God regarding marriage and the intermarriage with the foreigners and so forth. It seemed like when Nehemiah left, Malachi comes. And he reforms. He brings forth the message of reform that when Nehemiah comes back, he executes those. He puts those things into practice. He's being led by God, but Malachi was the one that comes in. So he fills a gap between the trip where Nehemiah had served as governor and now had left, and while he's gone, Malachi steps in. God does things that way too. There's filling the gaps and keeping things going, and then Nehemiah comes back and tries to faithfully execute those things and make sure that they're following as they should. That's why we see differences in Ezra and Nehemiah with the marriage thing, because they had quit doing those things, and we said, well, Why didn't they get that the first time? But I think when Nehemiah comes back, there's the emphasis upon that divorce and marrying foreign women and so forth, that Nehemiah executes that. That's an example that might fit. So that to me is a plausible one too. So in between 450 to 430 BC, the book was written. It's going to be the end of God speaking, as far as the prophets are concerned, before the coming of the history of the New Testament. Any questions on who he is, what his name is, time he lived, time he worked, why he's an angel, when he might just be a man, because he's sent. He has a message from God. All right? He had a distinctive style. You would see this later on in the synagogues. Didn't have synagogues now at this time. But the type of style was didactic or dialectic in the sense that it's a form of teaching. And it's the idea that what would happen is that the teacher would make an assertion or drive home a charge. You robbed God. How do I say I robbed God? And he would tell them. So there's assertion and charge. There's the fancied objection raised. How would you think he bring forth this charge, and it's bringing forth a possible objection, and then the teacher would refute it. And so we see that that's the type of style that we see. Now, taking part of that, Paul does a lot of this. One is we know from here, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? That may have just been a fancied assertion. Someone might say that, but how does he refute it? God forbid. God forbid. He brings up questions that someone may say, well, who said that? Well, someone might, in connection with the idea that we'll continue in sin that grace may abound because grace overrides the sins. And, well, I just continue in sin that grace may abound and God get all the glory. God forbid. So he asks these questions, not that they're being asked, but they might be asked. Fancy objection raised, or that type of form. And so there's the charge that is sent forth there. There are 8 examples of this type of teaching in these 4 chapters of Malachi. Let's see if we can get a hold of them. Chapter 1 and verse 2. I have loved you, saith Jehovah, yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? Well, who said that? Does it mean someone might say that? It's the idea of teaching. No, but they might think that, because I'm going to tell you what do you mean not Jehovah loved us? Wherein hast thou loved us? Then he brings forth, his point was not Esau, Jacob's brother, and Jehovah said, yet I love Jacob and Esau I hated. That's how he loved you. So the style of teaching was the idea of making an assertion, that sort of thing, or setting forth before them, and then the question that might come up, a fancied objection. How did you love us? I'm objecting to that. I don't believe you loved us that much. Well, someone might think that, and then his answer was what? Jacob I loved, Esau hated. That's how much I loved you. And we'll talk about that question in our questions. Verse 6. A son honoreth his father, and a servant his master. If then I am a father, where is mine honor? So there's the assertion that father honors father, and the servant is master. And if then I am a father, where is my honor? And if I am a master, where's my fear, said Jehovah of hosts? Oh, you old priests that despise my name. And then while we're there, you go right into another one. And you say, well, where have we despised that name? What's the answer? Ye offer polluted bread upon my altar. You despise me. Makes the connection. Our attitude toward God will be seen in our character of our sacrifices. And our sacrifice will be accepted in the character of our living a holy life, living as we should. While there in verse 7, Ye offer polluted bread upon mine altar. There's the priest's sins, the priests in their sin, that they allowed it. They offer, oh, that's good enough for us. God will be pleased, I'm sure. And so he's upset. But notice how he's teaching. He's doing this didactic style, this teaching style that would be prevalent among the Jews. So we go to divorce in chapter 2 and verse 14. When verse 13 says, you cover the altar of Jehovah with tears, as I said a while ago, with weeping, with sighing, insomuch that he regardeth not the offering any more, neither receiveth it with the good will of your hand, and yet ye say, wherefore? Well, I'm not necessarily saying that they said that. They may not be thinking about saying that. But he's made an assertion, God's not accepting your sacrifices. Wherefore? And then he'll bring it home. Because Jehovah hath been witness between thee and the wife of thy youth, against whom thou hast dealt treacherously, though she is thy companion and the wife of thy covenant. The wife of thy covenant. We make promises. We are joined by God. We're governed by his law. We're not joined to each other. We're joined to each other by God's law. That's why we can put away obeying that law a mate, and the other mate cannot marry. Because they're still bound to what? Not him, God's law. And that we need to understand that's what brings us, that's what the yoke that's placed upon them that brings them together. We're governed by God's law. Well, if one commits adultery and it makes me lose. Well, one doesn't commit adultery and this leaves. Well, I don't have a husband. Well, there's God's law judging that matter in both ways. One's has a right and the other one doesn't. Well, you can't do that because they're separate. They're not married to each other. They weren't joined because they married. They're joined because God's law said this is acceptable to him. And it governs that relationship. And if you want to talk about the one who joined you, God hates a divorce. He hates divorce. As we'll get into the details of that. Verse 17, ye have wearied Jehovah with your words. There's your assertion. Wearied Jehovah with your words. Yet you say, wherein have we wearied him? There's your fancied objection, question. And here he's driving it home. In that you say, every one that doeth evil is good in the sight of Jehovah, and he that delighteth in him, or where is the God of justice? What they do, they impugn God's justice. Don't ever do that. Job ran into that one. He sinned. When he didn't sin, when he said, Jehovah giveth and taketh away, blessed be the name of Jehovah. But at the end of that book, he starts impugning the justice of God. And that's something you do when you're in pain. That's something you do when you've got chronic illness. That's something you do when the world is just on your shoulders. You don't know where to turn. You start blaming God, and God's not just. And we got to be on guard for that. So these are the problems that we're seeing among the people. Chapter 3 and verse 7, there's the idea of returning to God, and it's it's the form that's there. From the days your fathers ye have turned aside from mine ordinances, and not kept them. Return to me, and I'll return to you, saith Jehovah. But you say, wherein shall we return? Well, he just told you. He's made the assertion, and in that, we see how we're going to return. We got to return to him. Be godly. But you say, wherein shall we return? Then we pick up with another one. Will a man rob God? Yet you rob me. Assertion. But you say, wherein have we robbed thee? Objection. With question. I'm questioning. Where have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. In tithes and offerings. You're cursed with a curse, for you robbed me, even the whole nation. Bring in the whole tithe in the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. They're not giving as they should, as their tithing should. And then in verse 13, your words have been stout against me, saith Jehovah, yet ye say, what have we spoken against thee? Ye have said it is vain to serve God. And what profit is it that we have kept his charge, and that we have walked mournfully before Jehovah of hosts? That's words against God. In vain have we been going through these difficulties with you, O God? So they were at the point of not living up to the standard of God, but impugning and being against God and his justice, and that Malachi is here with God's message. Not do that, but he had a particular style that would be prevalent with the rabbi teachers in the synagogue as well. So asking questions sometime was a way of teaching. So when Jesus is asking questions, and we say, well, he is just a 12-year-old. He's really not God in the flesh. He left that behind, and he came to this earth, and he was just kind of learning stuff as a good 12-year-old should. He was not a precocious 12-year-old. He didn't have his deity. They realized they were impressed with his answers. He wasn't just asking questions because he didn't know things. They were impressed with his answers. That's the form of teaching that we're doing. David?
Well, how many people want to say that God asked Adam a question in regard to Eve, but he didn't already know the answer? He wanted Adam to think.
Yeah, where is he?
And Jesus asked questions for the same reason. He wanted people to think. And sometimes Jesus asked questions, it's like he wanted them to state for the record. Like when he did miracles to feed the multitude. How many loaves and fishes did you have? It's almost like in a court of law. He wanted them to state for the record.
Yeah.
But there were so few that he miraculously made enough to feed thousands.
Yeah, you bring up points. There's more than one reason for asking questions, but that was one way of his teaching and getting things for them to think about and to understand. So I enjoy seeing those differences, but I enjoy thinking with him and realize that maybe those are questions he's fancied up because this is a way of teaching. This is how you've really done it. But that's a more interesting way of doing it, isn't it? You say, we robbed God. And then, well, I'll tell you how you robbed him. And we can just say you robbed God by the tithes. Well, yeah, but it kind of hits home because I'm answering a question that you might have, and maybe you ought to have that question in your mind to find out what's important with God. So we see that style. Three or four lessons I think we can learn from this. Ritual and religion is important, but it's not the ritual itself. I offer my tithes, 10%, all that. It's important, but it's not an end in itself. They're necessary under the law, but they should be expression of a sincere, moral, and deeply spiritual life. And so Malachi is saying in verse 10, which we'll get back to, neither will I accept an offering at your hand. Verse 11 says, for from the rising of the sun unto the going down of the same, my name shall be great among the Gentiles, and in every place incense shall be offered unto my name, and a pure offering for my name shall be great among the Gentiles, said Jehovah of hosts. So here's the indictment against the Jews, that it's not a pure offering, and we'll see that we'll get that context in here, that it was inferior. It was not the best that they could offer, and then they're not living the life that they should, but the Gentiles will. I mean, he's pointing toward the Gentiles, and of course we can see how that would be fulfilled in the gospel dispensation as well. Verses 8 through 10, backing up, the cheap religion avails nothing. Sacrifices that are grudgingly given are displeasing to God. So it's better something to be done, and we'll be answering that question. But let's read the text. When you offer the blind for sacrifice, say, Rachel, we're going to go off the sacrifices, and hey, let's get that blind lamb over there. We'll offer that this day. Blind. It was not to have blemish, was it? And it's no evil when you do that. And when you offer the lame and sick, it's no evil. Present it now unto thy governor. Will he be pleased with thee? Or will he accept thy person, said Jehovah of hosts? That's the key about sacrifices. And we'll get into Leviticus in our studies hopefully this year. But a lot of times offering was to accept the person. It wasn't, I'm offering God your worship. No, this sacrifice is so you'll accept me. That's why people would bring kings gifts so they would be accepted, to be able to talk to the king in the Old Testament. It was accepting one's person. That's the way God wanted them to see the sacrifices as well, to accept the very person. You don't care about that. You don't care if it is evil or not. Oh, that there were among you, and this is a question we'll answer, but to me it's just an interesting, it's stark. Oh, that there were among you that would shut the doors, that ye might not kindle fire on mine altar in vain. I have no pleasure in you, said Jehovah hosts. I don't have pleasure in you. Therefore, I'm not accepting your sacrifices. But the problem is with you. You offered a blind sacrifice. I have no pleasure in you, said Jehovah hosts. Neither will I accept an offering at your hand. Because of their attitude in offering, what the character at which they offered. And you say, well, at least we had a big crowd Sunday. How did God look about it? Nobody's worshiping God the way he wants to be worshiped, or if they're not living a life as they should. He would rather that we do what? Shut the doors. Shut the door. No, we want to always be open because of COVID. We want to always be open, and we're a place to worship. Well, if we come to worship, if we're living and serving God as we should, but from God's perspective, sometimes he'd just rather have the doors shut instead of offering up our sacrifices. It's all vain. It's all vain. I wonder, sometimes I've been in a lot of worship services. You have too in your life. Have you ever counted them? I haven't either. But I wonder how many of them have been vain. I know we're not perfect. That's why we got to strive every time we come. We offer sacrifices of praise unto his name. Am I giving the best? Am I singing and praising God and thinking about this teaching is going to each one? I'm receiving teaching from them. I'm giving teaching to them. And you're really involved in every aspect of that? And if that's not happening, Malachi helps us see that from God's perspective, it might be better to shut the doors than go through that exercise. But we all sang. It sure did sound pretty up here. How did it do out there for y'all? It's real good harmony. Well, there's more important things than not uttering a discord sound. But we want to do the best because this is part of our sacrifice unto God. David? You could eat it within your gates, but you can't offer it to God, can you? And that's a good point. Okay. Divorce and intermarriage with heathen idolaters thwart the purpose of God in securing himself a peculiar people. Look at verse 15. And did he not make one? And this is an interesting concept to follow. Verse 14, yet you say, wherefore, not accepting it, because Jehovah's been witness between thee and the wife of thy youth, against whom thou hast dealt treacherously, because you divorced her, and she's now unprotected in this world. She doesn't have one to help her as a husband, though she's thy companion and the wife of thy covenant. And then in verse 15, did he not make one, although he had residue of the Spirit? And here's our question, wherefore one? So, one what? So let's do some interpretation here. And the text will demand it. There's only one answer to this. There's only one thought to have. He had the residue of the Spirit. And he made one. So he had plenty of creative substance that would come from the Holy Spirit or from the Spirit of God. So it's the idea that I had a lot of things to make things with as I brought everything into existence. Although he had residue of the Spirit, he did not make one, and did he not make one, although he had residue of the Spirit? And wherefore one he sought a goodly seed. Take heed to your spirit. So he's driving home God's Spirit. There was plenty of left over. We could make all sorts of different things, but I made one, thank you, I made one seed, one people, and they were to be holy. And I had the residue to make more than that, but I wanted you to be holy, and that's the point that he's making. He sought a godly seed. Take heed therefore to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously against the wife of his youth. You are to be holy, and you're not being holy when you're divorcing your innocent mate. And so you got residue of the Spirit. That's image you don't think about, but you have to when you study the Old Testament, and you got to realize, why does he talk about spirit? Because he wants our spirit. Take heed to your spirit. I'm looking at my spirit. I could have made all sorts of peoples, but I made one people. And it wasn't because you're so great that I'm your God. And all of those things, he reminds them that all the time. He will make sure that they understand their God is not one that has to have a lot of people to accomplish his battles. Gideon. He's trying to let those people know I'm God, but here he said, I'm seeking a godly seed, and I don't have one. And yet you show off in your sacrifices, but I'm not heeding, because somebody's tears are on that altar, and it's your wife. It's your wife that you've dealt treacherously, and that's part of what's coming up to me as a sacrifice, and I will not accept it. Vivid imagery, wonderful ways of teaching is what we're learning from there. And then when he gets after the priests in chapter 2, 1 through 9, and we won't go into the details of that because we will get in the details of that. But there's a discipline in the law, what kind of character of the tithing. The first fruits and the best goes to God. And that here are the priests, that they are custodians of the law. That law needs to be applied correctly, and they're not doing that. They're not applying it according to the way God has revealed it. And so, but you ought to be able to go to the priest and find knowledge, and they receive it out of their mouth. But verse 7, the priest's lips should keep knowledge. It should be a storehouse for knowledge for the people. And they should seek the law at his mouth, for he is the messenger of Jehovah of hosts. Here he is, my messenger. He's not Malachi the prophet, but he's the priest offering up our testimony to them. But you're turned aside out of the way. You caused many to stumble in the law. You corrupted the covenant of Levi, said Jehovah of hosts. Therefore I also have made you contemptible and base before all the people, according as you kept not my ways and have not respect of persons, but have had respect of persons in the law. That they're going to take care of a rich man over a poor man. Just ungodly, evil. Malachi is trying to bring forth reform, and Nehemiah comes along, I think, and when he comes back to town, he has something to work with, and it fits that way. Any questions or comments on the lessons learned? I saved what's fulfillment of the law of Moses and Elijah the prophet returning, how that's fulfilled, but that'll be our last question in this short series. Any comments you want to add? This is interesting because you can take a passage from God, or how God uses that, but an incident, and he'll apply it two different ways. This is the burden or the oracle of the word of Jehovah unto Israel, and by Malachi, he says, I have loved you, saith Jehovah. And you say, wherein hast thou loved us? And what's the answer? God, where have loved us? Well, that's a statement. How did you show you loved us? You stated that, but how? Wherein did you love us? He wants to know wherein, what action? I know your statement, and they can all agree with that. That's from God's word. So he loved Jacob hated Esau. Well, how did you do that? Now, I want to pause here because Paul argues, and that's the next question, in Romans 9, it's totally different from this. Well, that's the only way you could apply that passage. Well, when God goes two ways, you know what I'll do? I will interpret everything that way. No, I will go and investigate all of the things of God on that passage and realize two different scenarios he offers. And both of them, he's loving Jacob, he's hating Esau. Romans 9, he's trying to show that it's my will how things were done. It has nothing to do. I chose Jacob. And it wasn't, I can hate who I hate and I can love who I love, because before they became a people, while they were still in the womb, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Here the firstborn, in that twins, Esau, Jacob be the one he chooses. Totally against man's wisdom. But what does he say here? He doesn't say anything about that incident in that context. He says, well, Esau I hated, made the mountains a desolation, gave his heritage to the jackals. Wherefore Edom saith, we are beaten down. That's Esau. That's not before they were born. And we got to stop. But there's, again, both of those things are true and are connected with asserting the same point. Different ways in which he showed that. I don't have a third one that I can teach. But the point is that this particular statement is used two different ways in the scriptures, and we'll come back and get that nailed down more fully next time. But we'll begin those questions, and we'll get into question 3. The outlines are there for you. I'm sure that they will be online when I get them to Norris. It's not his fault. I didn't have time to get them to him today. So we'll get that online if you want to get them there. Any questions or comments? Okay, thank you.